once it was clear we were over South Vietnam, a lot of people were looking out the window, and I didn't crowd to get to the window, but I did notice we flew over some areas that looked like moonscape with water.
Mm, mhm,
Lots. I mean, close to the airport, there were a lot of areas with obvious craters. Uh,
mm,
the impression on landing, um, heat and humidity. Uh, then this group of people standing in line waiting to get on the plane were getting
mm,
off. And then inside the terminal, lots of people. And then there was this one group over in the corner, which was quite obviously Americans wearing tiger camouflage
mm.
rather than standard uniform. And a whole bunch of people who I assumed were Cambodians, men, women, and children, with clusters of bags around them. They were the only ones in the airport carrying weapons.
These U.S. forces in the,
No, and the Cambodian irregulars.
I see.
Again, they could. I mean, they could have been ethnic Chinese. They could have been Montagnards. But for some reason, I thought they were Cambodians.
So these are
Uh,
special forces, and
yeah.
they had their
Well, yeah.
weapons.
And
Yeah.
so that kind of surprised me. Here I am in Vietnam, and nobody is carrying a weapon except this group of special forces irregulars. Um, then
Hmm.
we were directed to buses to go to Long Binh, which I think almost everybody passing through Bin Laden Airport without some special orders was processed through Long Binh, a separate facility.
Right.
And we get on the bus, and I remember the last training movie I had seen at Fort Sill was to the effect that every movement in Vietnam was a tactical movement, and that you briefed the convoy on how to respond to an ambush. You rearrange things to have, instead of just getting on a truck and going somewhere, that you were set up to fight back quickly. So we get on this bus, and about the only thing, two things about it, looks like a big school bus painted army green. The only thing tactical about it was there was some heavy grating over the windows,
Sure. Yeah.
and the guy driving it had an M16 with one magazine.
And the grating on the windows, that's to prevent people from throwing grenades through the windows. Is that right?
That was my guess. I
Yeah.
don't think it was to keep them from getting on.
Yeah, that's right. I want to ask you about this line of troops, these troops that are lined up as you and the others are deplaning. I'm assuming these are troops who are heading home.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any recollections of them? We're talking about things that happened over 50 years ago, I understand, but do you have any recollections of them, of, if you don't remember specific things any of them might have said, or any specific things any of them said, a sense of what
Well,
they might have said based on your memory, if they said
I,
anything?
I have heard reports of supposedly the departing troops yelling discouraging things to the arrivals. I don't remember that specifically. What I do remember, though, is when the last of the people got off the plane, there was a spontaneous cheer for the people who were getting ready to get on the plane.
What was the first thing you saw, heard, experienced that drove home to you in a concrete way that you were in a war zone? You said that when you flew in, you could see the craters, the bomb craters that had filled in. Perhaps that's it. But I'm wondering, is there something else that really drove home to you, or what was the first thing that drove that point home to you in a very concrete way that, yes, this is a war zone that I'm in?
Well, when I was going through the 5-day training, new guy training program, uh, the, the temporary barracks at the replacement detachment, or whatever they call it, was right next to the headquarters of the division artillery. And we had been, me and the two other lieutenants who were in the same cycle had been invited to go to the officers club at the division artillery anytime we wanted to. And I remember coming back from one of the days of the coursework, and stopping at the officers club And the officers club sounds magnificent. It was a small hooch with
Mm.
one guy behind the bar, a refrigerator and a TV and some small tables. I mean, it wasn't that much, but it did have cold beer.
Yeah.
Um, and I had gone outside to drink the beer that I had ordered, and all of a sudden I hear machine gun fire in the distance and some flares going off. This around dusk. And I had this, the first thought was, well, this is quite a show. I'll just get another beer and sit here and watch it for a while. And then it finally dawned on me, well, it wasn't a long delay, but it dawned on me, this was not an exercise. It could have been an exercise. I didn't know that. But that was the first time I had ever actually heard something being fired in anger. The real introduction was the first battle I was in, where we had gone in the middle of the night cross country, which is not terribly attractive in large land noisy machines, to go to respond to a village that had been, I think, at least partially overrun by NBA forces about a mile from the Cambodian border. And actually, I occasionally suppress the memory, I guess, because there were two incidents on the way there. One was that we were traveling initially in the dark, flares being dropped overhead by some helicopter, um, and not very good light. And as it gets lighter and lighter, finally, CO pulls. We've been traveling very slowly with dismount, with people on foot using mine detectors to clear the route as we went, or to check it at least. And it got light enough. We're on a dirt road, and I learned later that they typically operated that if you could see, the lead vehicle was responsible for deciding whether or not there was any disturbance in the roadbed that indicated mining.
Yeah.
So he's pulled the walking mine detectors, and having, I don't remember whether he told me or not, but obviously having decided it was light enough now to do visual inspection of the road. And we went maybe 100 yards, and there was a huge explosion in front of us. We were in the second, there was one vehicle in front of us. And I expected to see the lead vehicle laid out like, a paper cutout model. The things you see occasionally where you cut the paper out and then fold it up and it makes something. I expected it to be the unfolded version of that. Turned out it wasn't much damage to the vehicle at all. I also expected it to be followed immediately by an ambush from the people in the brush on either side of the road. There wasn't anybody there, just a mine. That was like, oh yeah, this counts. And then the big deal was, after we got to the village, we set up a perimeter and spent the night there. And that was the first battle I was in. And that battle opened with 4 or 5 rockets landing outside our perimeter. And these were rockets that are roughly the equivalent of a 105 millimeter artillery round or something like that. And that was a wake up. I mean, they landed while I was asleep.
Wow.
So that got real quick, because that battle, you in a movie or something like that, you often see hordes of people running toward an objective, whether you're behind them or watching them from the side or watching the people defending. It wasn't like that. It was just RPG fire, some machine gun fire coming in, and it was clear it was a battle going on, and I could see that some of our vehicles were burning, but I couldn't see any enemy at all.
You were just saying that you've got the projectiles flying, but you're not seeing the enemy. Was that the norm in the war you experienced, that you rarely actually see the enemy so long as that enemy is alive and not captured?
Um, yes, close. I actually saw one man in the process of surrendering. In other words, he was walking toward us with his hands up and had not been taken into custody yet. Other than that, I saw 3 live enemy. One of them I only saw his forearms.
as he was running away through the woods or something, or?
No, we were on a sweep, and an RPG hits one of the platoon leader's tracks, and at the same time, I see a puff of smoke coming from the base of a clump of brush. And we kept moving for a while, and when we stopped, the command track was adjacent to that clump of brush. I look down and I see two forearms holding an RPG launcher sticking out of the overhead cover on probably just an individual foxhole with some overhead cover. I shot at him. The hands disappeared. I didn't have a hand grenade. Eventually, a sergeant who was running up to replace a sergeant who'd been a temporary platoon leader and had been hit. As he was running by the hole, I pointed at the hole and he threw a grenade into it. The grenade went off and then there was a secondary explosion. So not much chance that anybody was going to get out of the hole. That's one man I saw live. And the other one, I'm not even sure was a soldier. No, excuse me. It's not 3, it's 4, because I did see somebody in black pajamas, the typical stereotype of a Viet Cong fighter, running across the front, across our column. And it's one of the strange things you say, well, nobody shot at him. I mean, we were in enough brush that you didn't see him coming from very far, and he didn't have very far to run until he was in brush again. You couldn't see him. And the second two were in an incident where we were responding to an ongoing substantial fight after one of the other troops in the squadron had, as we say, popped an ambush. And we were called up to join them. There was a lot of stuff going on. We stop on the road before actually joining the combat. It was an example of a sort of tactical discipline being failing because all the tracks had tended to park very close to each other as opposed to maintaining some standard distance. If somebody shot an RPG at them, I don't know how it could have gotten between them very easily. But I'm just sitting there waiting, firing going off in the near distance. A lot of confusion, smoke over the woods, whatever. And I look over, and these two guys in NVA sun helmets get up very close to the side of the road and start running toward the forest, where not where we heard the combat going on, but the same forest. And a lot of these roads that we traveled frequently had been, at one point, had rubber plantations down to very close to the road. And the ones that were used routinely for convoys. I have no idea when it happened, except it all happened before I got there. The trees had been cut down for maybe 50 meters on each side of the road. And not entirely, the debris hadn't been entirely cleared away. So these guys were running 50 meters, jumping over some trunks that had left behind. I got off a magazine against them, at them. I don't think I hit any. And nobody else noticed.
Wow.
So those were the two guys I saw. I mean, those are the 4 people I saw who were alive, plus the man who was in the process. You talk about things you remember. I'll never forget that this guy, when he was walking toward us, he walked with his hands up for a while, and then he just dropped them. And it was like, maybe it was projection, but it seemed pretty clear he barely had the will to survive, let alone to do anything. It was, I don't remember, I wasn't there when many people were taken as prisoner. I think it was SOP that you tied their hands. And this guy was just so absolutely dejected that the 2 troops that went out to collect him didn't tie his hands. They just took him back behind our line of tracks and gave him some cigarettes and water. In some sense, people would say, well, your job was to call for an artillery mission and then adjust it on whatever target you had identified or wanted fired. In my mind, the most important thing I did was keeping track of where we were, because that allowed me to fire artillery without hitting us. If I didn't know where we were, it was kind of hard to decide where to put artillery.
So your primary job then involves keeping track of where your forces are, the forces you're
Right.
with, and then to call coordinates in to artillery, who will then send in the shells on the beach for
And
the
then adjust them as needed when I see them land. One of my responsibilities was calling in what were called night defensive targets. And the artillery school solution is that you review the terrain, you coordinate your night defensive targets with the fire plan of the unit you're supporting. You're supposed to figure out likely enemy channels of approach and what you need, barriers, and blah, blah.
Mhm.
Well, the cavalry troops' fire plan was park in a circle and shoot out. So that wasn't much help. And after a while, it dawned on me that almost everywhere we spent the night, which is where this was appropriate, other than fixed uh, semi-permanent fortifications where that didn't apply at all, there was no way to say this is the likely approach and this isn't, or something like that. Eventually, I convinced the troop commander to always park his track pointed north, and I just put 4 targets out north, east, south, and west, one click out, so that I could have because they were pre-plotted. You called them in, and they were put on the map effectively for the batteries. So it was a lot faster to just call in and say fire target 1. Occasionally, we would stop somewhere where I'd say, okay, like if we parked near the woods, Boloy Woods, which we frequently parked near or occasionally went into, say, well, this place over here, the edge of the woods is where somebody, uh, in the case I'm thinking about, first I thought, well, that's where somebody might be watching us. And if they were going to launch an attack, that might be where they'd start because that's the way they could get closest to us under cover.
Yeah.
And so I occasionally would actually fire in a night defensive target. One night I decided to fire in a target because I had some uncertainty about where exactly we were located, and firing in a round gives you a marker. So you can say, well, that's further north than I thought it was. Well, that means I'm further south than I thought I was. Anyway, so I was going to call one in, and it had to be at least 800 meters away. I thought I'd passed for a click, but it was at least 800 meters away. And after I'm done, fired, I think I fired only 1 round, and that was it. And one of the troopers came over to advise me that the round I had just called in, actually, I think he was carrying. He had a steel shard about 4 inches long with jagged edges. He said, "Sir, that round you just fired just cut a hole in my clout." An armored cavalry troop facing light infantry, like most of the Viet Cong or NVA were, is a monster. I mean, the troop had, depending on how many vehicles were there, 20 to 30 50 caliber machine guns, 50 to 60 M60 machine guns. And after they arrived, anywhere from 4 to 9 Sheridans, which had a 152 millimeter shotgun effectively. So the only time we were anywhere near close to being overrun was the very first battle, the one that I didn't know what was going on. Nobody was communicating with me. And after it was all over, they actually found, I think, 2 or 3 bodies in the concertina wire, which was 10 or 20 yards, well, 10 yards typically in front of the vehicle. They didn't get into the perimeter, but they were too damn close.
Yeah, yeah.
But I wasn't adjusting artillery fire then at all and didn't even know that was happening. Typically, the most complex thing we would find is a rather large hole with a substantial roof over it and dirt. And I don't remember how well they were camouflaged. We spent some time in areas where there wasn't much vegetation at all. So if you build it carefully, all you had to do was pile some dirt on top. It looked like the other dirt.
Mm,
We found a couple of those that were big, and I think one of them had what looked like medical debris in it, so it may have been even used as a hospital ward. Um,
yeah.
the caches, some of them were just huge, um, and the one that was sort of the most complex was it was an area where all the civilians had been supposedly moved out, and I didn't see it being discovered. I don't even know how it was discovered, but we were eventually all called over where somebody had found this, and there was an old man, and they had an implement that was like designed like a hoe, but had a much heavier blade. Um, and when we got there, he was hoeing away at what looked like had been his vegetable garden, but there was no vegetation in it. And he was uncovering, um, I don't remember what color it was, but a plastic tarp. And then under the plastic tarp was this row of 100-pound bags of rice. I think all of them said US aid
Wow.
on the bags. It was 2 Chinook loads to take it out. And
Two
the
Chinook loads of USAID
rice.
rice that had fallen into the hands of the Viet Cong.
Well, it's interesting how it got there. We don't, I mean, we had no idea. I mean, what was obvious and also interesting was somebody had transported. It didn't grow there.
Right.
And so somebody was at least getting a water buffalo cart down some road track or something without being detected. And the CO, when we were about done with digging it up and moving it out, said, I really feel sorry for that guy. The Viet Cong probably made him work all night burying it, and then we made him work for a couple of hours unburying it.
Mm.
Actually, it's strange. Wasn't there. I don't think anybody ordered him to dig it up, but there's a good chance he was concerned about being friendly to all those armed men who had discovered a bunch of VC rice buried in his backyard.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And toward the end of it, the troops who were watching him dig discovered that if they just pulled on the tarp hard enough, they could just like peel it back. So he got, but it was an area where there were most of the civilians had been ordered to leave in the relocation program, which hardly achieved much success. But they kept filtering back,
Mm.
and it was in an area that we went through frequently, but we didn't stay at night very often. And you say, well, was that guy a Vietnam sympathizer? He may have been, but it didn't matter. If the local Viet Cong squad showed up with a cartload of rice and told him to help, he'd help
Sure. Yeah.
because he didn't have any option.
What was your assessment of the enemy? I gather that mostly you're dealing with Viet Cong. I do think there's some NVA in there. But
We never. I mean, after the Tet Offensive, which was a substantial period of time after the Tet Offensive, um, in the Tet Offensive, the main force units of the Viet Cong were heavily impacted,
right,
close to destroyed. Many of them were, well, some of them just disappeared or became ineffective. Many of them were re-personneled with individuals who were NVA. So we often were in fights we didn't know they were NVA or Viet Cong. Some of the Viet Cong main force units carried a lot of NVA regular army equipment. The fact that somebody we were fighting we found out was wearing NVA sun helmet didn't mean they were NVA. It just meant that they were considered appropriate for more efficient and complete supply. So I don't know. I mean, the people. The first battle I was in was a village next to the village, a mile from the Cambodian border. We assumed it was NVA because they were close. it could have been a main force Viet Cong unit. That wouldn't have made much sense.
Yeah.
When we some of the battles further away from the border, we just didn't know. The enemy, NVA, and particularly Viet Cong, are often assumed to be highly flexible, lightly armed, quick responders. Um, and there is some truth to that, particularly the lightly armed and fast moving occasionally. But most of the things that they attempted that were significant, like attempting to ambush those resupply convoys, it took them days to maneuver the forces that they needed into position for an ambush. And the simplest preventions for the convoys going through our area was just changing their route. You know, they had like to get from Saigon and Cu Chi up to the most northern base in Tainan City. There were like 3 or 4 different route structures that they could use for the convoy. And if the Viet Cong was preparing to ambush one of those routes, they only had a 25% chance roughly that anything was going to happen. And they weren't flexible in the sense that they could say, well, the convoy's not going this way, or we just got 15-minute notices that they're going to be on this route over here. They had no capacity to respond to something like that. The most of the people, I mean, you can't count the people you didn't find, but there was occasionally clear evidence that when we were going through the woods or through light brush or something like that, that there had been people there and they just left. And they were capable of essentially quick, efficient retreats. There were instances where you said, well, these people are persistent and brave, but again, their primary tactic was to leave. It's hard to imagine a Viet Cong or even an NVA unit that would have voluntarily stood their ground to fight an armored cavalry troop. Occasionally they did, but it'd be like, again, you don't know who wasn't there when the fight was on. There were times, I think, an explanation of what happened was that you and you had been designated to stay behind and everybody left. And then there was a small fight while everybody else got away. So the guys that were you and you were clearly demonstrated their bravery. They were not, they weren't supermen. No evidence of any, well, I wasn't a good shot. I don't think most of the people around me were terribly good shots. The VC weren't good shots either. We prevailed by the volume of fire, not by being somehow superior marksmen or more clever about something. What I remember is in the instances where we had any significant number of bodies that we recovered, how young they were. Like the first big battle I was in, and I think the total casualties on the enemy side, toe tagged, was about 97.
Wow.
And they all looked to be about 17.
Do you remember some females being among them?
No. The closest I get about females was a sister troop made an amazing. They weren't set up really as an ambush, but what they did was effectively an ambush. And they were using the Sheridan vehicles had infrared generators and infrared vision devices. And one of them picked up a obvious group of enemy soldiers. I think they were identified later as a VC, part of the VC battalion, marching down a road in column, and apparently not aware that this troop was set up for the night at a road intersection, picked them up on their night vision, and whoever, I mean, it was reported back to the troop commander. He told them to hold fire, and they just watched. And then suddenly, a group of people stepped out of the column, and looked like they were having a conference at the head of the column. Uh, and then they fired at them. They fired one flechette round from a Sheridan. Commanding officer later, in general commentary, said he thought that first round killed almost all of the people that they later picked up as bodies. The reason it's an answer to your question is that when they were collecting all the gear that they had been left behind, one of them was a manual for female soldiers.
Wow.
But never saw a female soldier, never saw a female body.
So you mentioned a number of times in your memoir that you're working with the RFs, the regional forces. Um, what I guess what was their mission, and what was your assessment of them as a combat force?
I'm not. I mean, I don't know what their government said their mission was. When we were briefed on arrival, the description was that they were sort of like the National Guard. And they varied in terms of what they did with us. It almost, most times, it was we would be going into an area, particularly if we were in a populated area, and they would go with us. And the court, it's kind of, it's always, you look back at it, I didn't pay that much attention to it. At the time. It's kind of strange because often we had one translator at best. Maybe they had a U.S. advisor who spoke, sort of functional military Vietnamese. So a lot of the coordination of who did what was kind of awkward. There was there were 2 or 3 RF outposts in the area where we did sweeps most often, and they sometimes we went out without them, sometimes they went with us, and their performance in terms of saying how good were they varied substantially. There was a period of time when we were finding lots of rice, and often we in the RFs decided the RFs would take the rice. And if that happened 2 or 3 times in a row, 2 or 3 days in a row, it seemed that quickly participating in our activities seemed to elicit more enthusiasm. I don't, maybe they just got more rice to eat. Maybe they were selling the rice, or maybe they were giving it to their families. I don't know. In terms of, I mean, and whatever you say about how well they were doing in their jobs, they tripped as many booby traps as we did, and maybe more. So there were an awful lot of RF soldiers who were fatally or seriously wounded, no matter how brave they were. They were brave enough to walk outside the perimeter. Combat effectiveness varied a great deal. I mean, if we got into a firefight, sometimes you'd notice that all the RF soldiers had decided that the appropriate place to be was immediately behind an armored vehicle. Other times, they were eager to go. I remember one incident where we had made a sweep and we were parked in a relatively open area facing some brush. We had RFs with us, and all of a sudden they started running into the brush. And the CO's on the phone or on the radio asking the nearest platoon leader, "What are they doing?" "I don't know." And trying to eventually got through to some local Vietnamese command that had some radar. It turned out these guys had somehow figured out that a fair distance away from us, somebody was cooking around a fire, and they went in to investigate without any prompting or asking anybody to go with them, and actually overwhelmed. I think it was 4 or 5. Uh, I don't remember how many of them were killed or how they knew it. I'm not sure they took any prisoners. But this was just a group of 4 or 5 North Vietnamese soldiers who'd been sent to join some Viet Cong unit in the area. And when it was all explained, it was sort of like, I don't believe this, because they had been noticed because they had set up a fire in the middle of the day to cook their rice. That's not stealthy.
Right.
And we were close enough, they should have heard us. But they were still just sitting there cooking their rice, and somehow the RFs noticed it, and the immediate initiative. And they were happy to eat the rice afterwards, but they didn't know there were any rice there when they started. So that was an example of aggressive behavior where they could have just stayed with us and said, by the way, there's some noise over there, or something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
There was one fight where we had RFs with us, and they did everything our troops did. Other fights where we had RF troops with us, and I said, if the shooting was on the left flank, they moved to the right flank, and if the shooting was on the right flank, they moved to the left flank.
Right. So it really did depend.
Well, the last battle I was in was near Tay Ninh City, and we had an RF company with us. They were, we didn't find out, but where they lived meant they probably were Khazai, which is a religion that I think exists only in the parts of Vietnam and that may not even exist anymore. They were anti-communist. When they joined us, I looked at them and said, "My God, these guys all have full gear." Whereas a lot of RFs would show up wearing flip-flops or blacktop sneakers, didn't have rain gear, didn't have a band, didn't have they might be carrying a rifle and 2 magazines or something like that. They had 1 grenade for every other guy or something like that. They were just, compared to U.S. troops, they were obviously underarmed, probably carrying less armament than the VC did.
Hmm.
And this RF troop came out. They all had the same uniform. They were all wearing helmets. They all had a rifle and several magazines, and they all had leather boots. And you look at it and say, why don't our RFs in the area we more frequently operated look like that? I don't know.
Yeah.
It may have been just that this was a more efficiently anti-communist subdivision of something.
Yeah.
But there was tremendous differences in the level of apparent discipline and training and equipment. And then the units that we operated with most, the behavior on different days was different. We talked about RFs. I don't think we ever had contact directly with the South Vietnamese Army. We did have one battle that we were joined by South Vietnamese Marines, and they were tough. That's kind of a cliche. We were in a fairly serious fight. They came up behind us. They weren't with us at the beginning of the fight. We had essentially withdrawn into a night position, and they just kept going and marched into the area where the Viet Cong fighters had been in the middle of the night. Now, for somebody moving anywhere or attacking at night is unattractive unless you have incredibly good training and stuff. But for all the firepower that the armored cavalry troop had, one of its disadvantages is it couldn't go anywhere quietly. So perhaps their bravado by attacking, by then most of the enemy had withdrawn, I think, but they didn't know that when they started. But then again, they arrived with full gear. You'd see RFs coming out of their compound and looking like stragglers occasionally. Marines, South Vietnamese Marines, when we could see before we went into the fight, we could see them unloading from trucks. When they unloaded from the trucks, they got in tactical formations and moved away. Actually, it's weird because I think the thing that is the most vivid memory was part of the initial training when I arrived, before I had been assigned to be a forward observer. And it was there was a 5-day sort of in-field briefing refresher course, whatever you want to call it. And the thing that I most vividly remember out of that, and it competes with far more significant danger-ridden memories, is a sergeant doing refresher. I mean, they had like a small bleachers, and there was, I'm not sure of the numbers, say magnitude 100 people in a small set of bleachers. And this sergeant is doing a review, like a 1 or 2 hour, I don't remember what the length was, a 1 or 2 hour review of first aid. And he did a shtick about sucking chest wounds. He said sucking chest wound. I had an idea what it was. I'd never had any training what a sucking chest wound was. And he went through this entire drill, and as he was going through the instructions, he was using almost classic Socratic method. Now, it wasn't intellectual Socratic method about, what do you think about this? But more, he would say, well, what do I do next? And point to some kid in the bleachers. And it was amazing how many of the kids he pointed to knew what to do next. If I ever run across somebody with a sucking chest wound and I've got a field bandage, I know what to do. Actually, it was before I got out of the Army. I had gone home. My home was in Tulsa, and my station when I arrived in the U.S. was in Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma. And my dad was working on his car, and I went out and was mostly just watching it. And I heard this bang, bang, bang. And my immediate thought was, why are they testing the perimeter guns this early? And then it dawned on me it was a car backfiring. In terms of personal impact, I think that perhaps the most important personal impact was being sort of at the mercy of a whole bunch of people I never would have met otherwise. And that implies that somehow they were threatening me. No. But if they didn't do their job, I could have been harmed. They all did. So I think it just sort of reinforced my confidence in a whole bunch of people that I may never have met.
That memory of the soldier next to you looking out for you, and you looking out for that soldier, and really having to rely on one another.
Yeah.